Minasan konnichiwa. Hello everyone. My name is Yuko Shimizu and I'm the Executive Director of the Japan Foundation Toronto. Thank you for tuning in today for a special presentation entitled Women Directors in Contemporary Japanese Cinema. If you are familiar with our center's programming, you may know that we screen Japanese films, classical and contemporary, on a regular basis. Cinema is a beloved visual art form that connects people everywhere, and fans of Japanese cinema can be found all around the world. However, while names like Kurosawa, Ozu, and Miyazaki are internationally celebrated, for too long women filmmakers have been missing from the spotlight. Today we're excited to share with you an in-depth study of Japanese women directors who are flourishing. These filmmakers are crafting unique, dazzling stories, winning awards, and leaving their marks on the international market. Joining us today is Professor Colleen Laird from the University of British Columbia. An expert on Japanese media and popular culture, Professor Laird has published and presented extensively on women directors and their relationships with the Japanese film market. With the support of the Japan Foundation Toronto grant, as well as a connection grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Professor Laird is currently putting together the Japanese Women Directors Project with collaborators from Europe and Japan. Please enjoy this talk and make sure to tune in to our upcoming screenings of select films by renowned Japanese women directors. I hope today's presentation shines a light on amazing creative filmmakers and that one day the names of Haneda Sumiko, Ninagawa Mika, or Uegami Naoko will too be recognized by fans around the world. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cindy, and I am a program officer at the Japan Foundation Toronto. Thank you for joining us today. A little introduction about how this event will go. First, Professor Laird will give her presentation for around 20 to 25 minutes, and then I will return and we will have a very brief but hopefully insightful interview about both historic and contemporary women directors in Japanese cinema. Without any further ado, I will hand over the screen to Professor Laird. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for that warm introduction and welcome. It really is a pleasure to be part of this series. Thank you for inviting me and to speak on one of my favorite topics, which is Japanese women directors. So currently there is a generation of women directors who have, I would say, achieved significant success within Japanese media industries. Their works have earned domestic and international awards, and many have more recently secured streaming partnerships. This increase in women's representation and access to filmmaking really only started about 15 years ago or so in the mid-2000s when we saw something of a boom of women directors. Now, this boom, which appears historically now as a new generation of cinema authorship, was entirely unprecedented within Japan. Although there were women directors before the 2000s, they were few and far between, and with a handful of notable exceptions, they were generally not very successful in terms of securing support to make a career of directing. So the first woman director was Sakane Tazuko, and she made her only commercial narrative film in 1936. She was an interesting character, and she did have a long career in cinema wearing various hats, such as scripter, editor, assistant director, and documentary filmmaker. Sakane became involved with film circles in the 1920s because her father, who was a film devotee and hobby screenwriter, was also an investor in Nippon Katsudo Shashin Studio, or, as we now know it, Nikatsu Studios. After an ill-matched arranged marriage followed by a divorce, her father arranged a position as an assistant director for her in 1928. Now, despite the title, Sakane was tasked with duties better suited for the role of secretary, actually, but she was assigned to work under Mizoguchi Kenji. They got along, and this worked out in her favor. Over time, and with Mizoguchi's help, she secured an opportunity to direct Hatsusugata in 1936. Now, unfortunately, no copy of the film exists today, but the Museum of Kyoto does have a copy of Sakane's own script with her handwritten notations in their collection, along with a variety of Sakane's personal effects, which were generously donated to the museum by her family. Well, sadly, Hatsugata was a commercial failure, in no small part because the film was billed as the first film by a woman, and so it came under some rather unfair and unwarranted scrutiny based on gendered expectations. Unable to gain permission to make a second commercial film, Sakane, again with support from Mizoguchi, turned to documentary filmmaking instead and traveled overseas to Manchuria to document the war. Now, Japan's second woman director was the celebrated actress Tanaka Kinoyo. Over the course of her acting career, she appeared in over 250 films and also had a presence in television. Her acting filmography includes scores of titles that would be familiar to cinephiles, including her role in Gosho Heinosuke's 1931 film The Neighbor's Wife and Mine, or Madame to Nyobo, Japan's first full sound film. And at the age of 65, she won the Berlin International Film Festival Best Actress Award for her work in Kumaike's Sandakan number 8, brothel number 8, in 1974, just 2 years before her death. She also supported the National Film Center of Japan, now the National Film Archive of Japan, with the donation of most of her film and industry memorabilia, a great deal of which is on display in their permanent exhibit. In the latter half of her career, from 1953 to 1962, Tanaka directed 6 films in total. The first, Koibumi, or Love Letters, premiered in 1953 and was actually selected for competition at Cannes in 1954, although it did not win. So you'll note that there's a 17-year gap between Sakane, 1936, and Tanaka during a period of otherwise robust filmmaking in Japan. Like Sakane, Tanaka had a long working history with Mizoguchi Kenji and starred in over 10 of his films, including internationally well-known titles like The Life of Oharu or Saikaku Ichidai Onna, 1952, Ugetsu, 1953, and Sancho the Bailiff, Sancho Dayu, 1954. Unlike Sakane, Mizoguchi did not support Tanaka's desire to direct films, but due to her long and illustrious career, Tanaka had other friends in high places, such as Ozu Yasujiro, Naruse Mikio, and Kinoshita Keisuke, who vouched for her and convinced the executives at Shinto Studio to give her a chance. So as I said, Tanaka made 6 films in total. Love Letter, The Moon Has Risen, The Eternal Breasts, The Wandering Princess, Girls in the Night, and Love Under the Crucifix. There we go. We can see the clear influence and network of support for Tanaka in the credits for her films, without which she would never have secured a recommendation from the Directors Guild of Japan to direct films. So, for example, Kinoshita Keisuke helped write the script for Love Letters, and Ozu had a hand in the screenplay for The Moon Has Risen. After Tanaka's run of 6 films, we really don't see other women behind the camera making what we might call a body of work in commercial cinema until the 2000s. And I hope this should feel a little shocking. This isn't to say that women never made films, they did here and there, but no one really secured the status or support to establish a career, and not for lack of trying. So I'll take this opportunity to point to the work Catherine Munro Holtz has done to compile a database of women working in Japanese film industries, which is a great resource. I also would be remiss if I did not point out that some exceptional women did find careers in industry alternatives, especially documentaries, PR filmmaking, and science or culture films. So for example, Haneda Sumiko was a prolific award-winning documentarian who made over 90 films. She worked for Iwanami Productions from 1950 to 1980, originally as a film editor, and then produced her own films thereafter. Hamano Sachi began her career at Wakamatsu Pro Studio, and since her first film in 1971, she has made over 300 pink films and runs her own production company, Tantasha. And many women found avenues in experimental filmmaking, especially in making low-budget independent shorts, often pseudo-documentaries, which is exactly how Kawase Naomi got her start. So, of course, Kawase is the most famous Japanese woman director working today and has earned an array of awards, including the Cannes Camera d'Or in 1997 for Suzaku, or Moe no Suzaku, and the Cannes Grand Prix in 2008 for The Morning Forest, or Mogari no Mori. As many will know, she was also selected as the official documentarian for the 2020-2021 Tokyo Olympics. But in mainstream commercial cinema or narrative cinema, we really do not see a strong showing of women directors by the numbers until 40 years after Tanaka Kinoyo finished her 6th and final film. Now, as I said at the start of this talk, women began to find opportunities in and access to mainstream commercial cinema industries in the mid to late aughts. So, for example, Ogigami Naoko's third feature-length film, Kamome Diner, Kamome Shokudo, Nishikawa Miwa's second feature-length film, Sway, or Yudedu, and Ninagawa Mika's debut film, Sakuran, were all released in 2006. Iguchi Nami finished her second full-length feature film, Don't Laugh at My Romance, or Hito no Sexu wo Warau na, in 2007. Tanada Yuki screened her third film, Billion Yen Girl, or Hyakuman En to Nigemushi Onna, in 2008. Television director Kitagawa Eriko released her first film, Halfway, in 2009, and Omori Mika, another prolific television director, released her debut film, Puru, Pool, in 2009, a film that was actually made possible by the successes of Ogigami Naoko's endeavors. Now, additionally, as I have said, Kawase Naomi won the Grand Prix at Cannes in 2008 for The Morning Forest. And this is a film I see as a shift in style from her earlier experiments in combining documentary footage with professional acting to more crowd-pleasing mass market narrative dramas that we now see coming from her quite frequently, like 2015's Sweet Bean or On, 2017's Radiance or Hikari, and 2020's True Mothers or Asaga Kuru. Before I focus on a few of these directors to introduce their careers and notable films, you might be wondering what happened at the turn of the century to support and promote this new and really first generation of women directors, and rightly so. There are several factors. Some I think are perhaps more obvious than others. So to begin with, it's important to understand that in the commercial Japanese studio system from the 1920s up to the 1960s, and to some extent in the 1970s, one could not just decide to become a filmmaker. There was a hierarchy within the studios, like a ladder of experience. Generally, one started out as a crew member, an editor, or a screenwriter, and worked his way up through promotions to assistant director and then director. Often there were tests he had to pass and licensing procedures, especially under imperial rule during the Pacific War. And it mattered who he knew and who would support his advancement, who would vouch for him. So I say he and his here in this system because with the exception of Sakane Tazuko and Tanaka Kinuyo, women were not promoted to the role of director. In the late 1960s into the 1970s, the studios suffered tremendous financial setbacks due to a couple of things: strong competition with television and other leisure activities, the dismantling of the block booking system of vertical integration, and the large-scale loss of female-identifying moviegoers who were just not attracted to the types of films that the studios were making at that time. And those were largely crime films, sexploitation films, period films or jidaigeki, and science fiction films. So eventually, 3 of the 5 major studios folded in bankruptcy. At the same time, there was a rise in independent cinema production networks, but these were still male-dominated circles, and filmmaking equipment was expensive, cumbersome, and required a crew of people working together. Women did not often have access to equipment or technical training, and like many women working in the industry even today, they experienced what we might call difficulties asserting leadership roles over mostly male crews. However, the conditions of technology, expense, and expertise changed quite dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s. During these decades, there was a market of affordable and easy to use equipment for making home movies. So, of course, we had the light and portable Super 8 film camera since the 1960s, but film was expensive and had to be developed. The mass market production of video camcorders and then, of course, digital cameras in the 80s and 90s meant that really anyone could make a movie at home and on the cheap, and not often just as an independent production, but as importantly, a solo production. So advancements in and accessibility of technology was an important factor. However, as I mentioned, right, there was a significant drop off in female spectatorship in the 1960s, and that continued for several decades. Understandably, if most women are not really active moviegoers or cinephiles, they likewise won't be inspired to pursue that career path. But in the late 1980s and 1990s, film distributors and exhibitors in Japan finally turned their attention to this large missing demographic, especially since market reports revealed that women between the ages of 20 and 34 were sitting on large reserves of expendable income. At this time, and we still see this today, Women were waiting longer in their lives to pursue marriage, sometimes choosing not to marry at all. They were finding and digging into careers, and often still living with their parents. So, with incomes and no rent or household expenses, this particular age demographic, which marketers call the F1SO, became a target audience for all manners of goods and services, and this included film. So movie theaters invested in remodeling spaces to appeal to women, or that they thought would appeal to women, right? They prioritized programming that appealed to women, and their marketing materials, had that sort of gendered look to them. And they designed special promotions like Ladies' Day discounts and promotional giveaways that they thought would appeal to women. So, buy a movie ticket and get into a lottery, and then win some cookware. It wasn't long before distributors began to seek out and support creatives whose works they thought would be inherently appealing to women. And that was the idea, of course, that women would want to watch films made by other women. Distribution companies actively sought out new talent, honed in on women's works at festivals, and invested in marketing materials and campaigns that connected women consumers to women creatives, often linking up with partners in television and print publishing. So while there was a moneyed interest in finding, supporting, and marketing women directors, there was also already many informal networks seeking to foster and promote women in film. So film festivals like the PIA Film Festival and the Image Forum Festival that have substantial cash prizes and are venues at which distributors can option films played and still played a tremendous role in launching careers, right? So it's one thing to be able to finance your own independent film, but it's quite another thing to get that film seen by audiences. Several small distribution companies and exhibition venues had already dedicated attention to supporting women filmmakers. So, for example, programming at Iwanami Hall in Tokyo, managed formerly by Takana Etsuko, who herself wanted to be a film director but was barred from promotion to the role. So, places like Iwanami Hall focused on female audiences and, when possible, female filmmakers in their programming, although this was mostly international cinema. Production company Paradise Cafe, for example, produced a number of films in the 2000s and 2010s, and a good third of them were films by women at the helm. And there were university circles and private clubs that organized talks, published essays, and supported screenings that focused on women directors. Many times, these informal networks were run by women who had found success in adjacent industries such as television, print publication, and manga. And there are similar partnerships between women directors and women writers. For example, now many female directors adapt the works of female novelists and manga artists. As far as training, we also saw the establishment and proliferation of several technical film schools and institutes in Japan with open enrollment, as well as course offerings in film studies in universities. So, for example, both Tanada Yuki and Ikuchi Nami graduated from Image Forum's Institute of the Moving Image. Ogigami Naoko majored in image science at Chiba University, and Asato Mari took classes at the Film School of Tokyo, or Eiga Bigakko, and the Tokyo University of Arts, or Tokyo Geijutsu Daigaku. And she was also a member of the Independent Film Circle at Yokohama National University, so a student club. These more formal kinds of institutional infrastructures tend to foster, informal mentoring connections, and that plays a role as well. So, for example, Koreeda Hirokazu, probably many people have heard of this name, mentored Nishikawa Miwa, and the two have established a production company together called Bunduku. Similarly, Asato Mari's mentor is famous horror director Kurosawa Kiyoshi. That said, even though the situation has changed and women have greater access to and aspiration for filmmaking, there are still several barriers that make it a difficult career and industry, as well as barriers for you out there who might be inspired to access more Japanese films directed by women. For folks who have been following the news surrounding Japanese cinema in the last couple of months, you're probably aware that sexism, sexual harassment, and sexual assault is still very much a real problem in the structural hierarchies of filmmaking industries. Many actresses have come forward to talk about their experiences of sexual assault, especially by male directors. And this gendered power dynamic pervades the industry in Japan as it does elsewhere. Several women directors have discussed difficulties they encounter with some male crew members that, for example, don't want to take direction from a woman or continue to second guess their technical knowledge. There's also a problem of substantial public representation. Many women directors don't want to represent a gendered public position. They don't want to be labeled as a quote unquote woman director. So they resist questions or conversations about gender and labor in film industries. This doesn't mean that they aren't working to support each other, I think, in roundabout ways that are often invisible to the public, but it does mean that their silence on these issues negates some important constructive conversations and the kind of visibility that can empower and inspire young women to also go into the career. And since film financing and mentorship is still based on connections, this resistance to what might be perceived as a political subject position, it does get in the way of building strong, visible support networks for the next generation. That said, some members of the initial boom, now that they're older, do acknowledge that there are certain aspects of gender that present barriers in their careers. And this is such as having children and taking care of families. For example, this was the case with Iguchi Nami, who made some really interesting films and had a really promising, exciting career. And then she did leave filmmaking to have a family because she felt that she couldn't manage filmmaking at the same time. So there are missing systems of structural support for women who want to be career filmmakers, as well as, for example, mothers. There's also still a very large barrier of distribution in international markets, particularly when it comes to issues of language. So the international DVD market still overlooks women directors, and this makes some revealing assumptions or reveals some assumptions about demographics and the distributor's own interests. While you can find many films on DVD in the domestic Japanese market, and then therefore through international retail sites like Amazon Japan, for example, most don't have subtitles. So this then excludes otherwise, potential viewers who don't have Japanese language skills, of course, and this includes students in the classroom. So even though I have a personal library of films by women directors for both my research and enjoyment, I can share very few of them with my students due to this language barrier. And finally, and more recently, there's another quite unexpected barrier. Companies like Netflix and Amazon have taken an interest in Japanese media content and have amplified their options and holdings on their streaming platforms. And this is actually really very recently. They seem to be supporting women directors, which I find to be very interesting. So, for example, Tanada Yuki has made a series for both Netflix and Amazon. Ninagawa Mika has made a series for Netflix, and Ogigami Naoko has written for Netflix. And Amazon has included many films by these directors in its catalog. However, many of the titles are region blocked. You cannot watch them outside of Japan. The more that streaming platforms secure the rights to films for streaming only purposes, the less we will see in terms of material DVD production. And generally, I think that there is a trend globally in that direction. So this presents a new kind of barrier if a film is distributed in a way that is region blocked. I don't know what this portends for the future of filmmaking and distribution, but this is especially why it's so important to make an effort to include diversity and intersectionality whenever we can. So many thanks to the Japan Foundation for including films with subtitles, both by Hanade Sumiko and Ando Momoko in this series. Many thanks, it's really important. So I'm going to end my talk here by highlighting three of the directors I work on in my own research. I'm very grateful that there's so many directors to choose from, but the three I focus on are quite interesting to me because their films and styles are so different, and their pathways to filmmaking are also quite distinct, and also I really like their films. So they are Ninagawa Mika, Nishikawa Miwa, and Ogigami Naoko. So I'm happy to say that you can find most of their works fairly easily and with English subtitles, thank goodness. Within Japan, Ninagawa Mika is more well known as a quite famous fashion and art photographer. She has a remarkable and distinct style of photography, which is dominated aesthetically by extreme color saturation and high contrast exposure. As a commercial photographer, she works with high-end designers and with celebrities, and she's commissioned regularly to shoot for Japan's top fashion magazines. As an art photographer, she has some dominant topical motifs that have become consistent throughout her career. So these include images of flowers, especially cherry blossom, sakura, still lives of everyday objects, and anything that is red, a color which she is particularly drawn to, as well as self-portraits. Many of these images find a home in her films as well, which are likewise extravaganzas of color and saturation. We see flowers, often with metaphorical implications, celebrities, the dominance of the color red, and increasingly more often, Ninagawa cameos, which is a kind of self-portrait, right? So what I like so much about Ninagawa's films is this assertion of style that, in terms of film, is auteur-esque. I love her dedication to visual excess and her openness in talking about gender as it relates to her vision and experiences as a filmmaker. For those interested, I recommend her first film, Sakuran, as a place to start. It's an entirely delightful, anachronistic film set in a reimagination of the Edo period Yoshiwara pleasure district. And like most Ninagawa films, it's a real feast for the eyes. Whereas Ninagawa gives us visions that are edgy and excessive and almost maybe garish, Nishikawa Miwa is far more restrained and will remind viewers more of what they expect from Japanese art cinema. Nishikawa's films feel like they fit into an established canon of Japanese film. They're thoughtful, the pacing is slower, the writing and dialogue is crafted in an almost literary manner, I think. And she plays with light and shadow in a way that feels almost nostalgic. She has adopted a preference for that low camera position and long shots that is so familiar in the classics. Notably, Nishikawa earned her degree in literature from Waseda University, and for me, this background in writing shows. Nishikawa has published many novelizations of her films, as well as additional original stories, but she has also adapted the works of notable authors, including Natsume Soseki and Asaki Ryuzo. Unlike Ninagawa, who came to filmmaking as an established and quite acclaimed photographer, Nishikawa comes to film through the mentorship path. So, as I said, right, she worked on the crew of Koreeda's 1998 film Afterlife, or Wonderful Life, and he helped produce and promote her first film, Wild Berries, or Hebi Ichiko. This working relationship has continued to this day. As I said, they have established a production company, Bunbuku. But more than that, I see their works as sometimes speaking to each other. A dominant theme in Nishikawa's films has been the flimsy or flexible nature of truth based on individual perspective and the act of testimony. Lies and liars feature dramatically or dominantly in her narratives, and she persistently asks us to question, when does a lie become an instrument of harm or power? And conversely, is the power of truth in our cultures also an instrument of harm? Notably, this was also the underlying theme in Koreeda's 2017 film The Third Murder, or Sandome no Satsujin, which starred Yakusho Koji as an ex-convict. And then interestingly, Yakusho also played an ex-convict in Nishikawa's most recent film, Under the Open Sky, Subarashiki Seikai, in 2020, in which rumors and gossip, or in other words, lies, proved to be quite hazardous indeed. So for folks who are new to Nishikawa, I recommend starting with a compelling and nuanced film, Sway, starring Odagiri and Kagawa Teruyuki. So finally, and in absolutely no way least, Ogigami Naoko. In her works, Ogigami brings us that high contrast lighting of Ninagawa's excess, mixed with Nishikawa's more subtle and withdrawn color palette and preference for a distanced camera. Her works help and encourage us to blow off some steam, I think, and tension in our lives, emotions that are perhaps heightened in the visions of excess in Ninagawa's films and the philosophical dramas of Nishikawa's narratives. Ogigami's films are engaging and meticulous, but there is room to breathe in them, to enjoy moments and atmosphere and being alive. So usually this means an appreciation of food, the passing of time, and good company. Notably distinct from either Ninagawa or Nishikawa's works, Ogigami's films are largely comedies, howsoever sometimes understated. They are films that I think we most desperately need. Over the years, Ogigami has established a career that resonates with ensemble productions. Whereas Ninagawa represents a lateral transition between industries, and Nishikawa represents a trajectory enhanced by mentorship, Ogigami is illustrative of the festival pathway for filmmakers. So after studying at both Chiba University and the University of Southern California, Ogigami won the scholarship prize at the Pia Film Festival for her short film, Hoshino-kun and Yume-no-kun in 2000. And she used that prize money to produce her first full-length film, Yoshino's Barbershop, or Baba Yoshino, in 2004. This was her first collaboration with comedian Motai Masako, who appears in many of her films, as well in TV series Yappari Neko ga Suki and Tu Kuru, both of which feature Kobayashi Satomi as well. Ogigami won another scholarship prize for Yoshino's Barbershop, and that funded her next film, Love is 575, or Koi wa Goshichigo. Thereafter, Ogigami left Japan, actually, to film in Finland, where she gathered a crew of Finns to form the company Surkitos, or thank you in Finnish. That's my best attempt at Finnish. She has worked with the same crew on many films under the same production name for many years and repeatedly casts familiar faces such as Motai Masako and Kobayashi Satomi, as well as Ichikawa Mikako in her films. The familiarity she crafts across her works, working with the same close-knit group, does, I think, make one feel at home when watching her films. So any Ogigami film is a perfect place to start, but if you happen to like cats as I do, then perhaps the 2012 film Rent a Cat or Rentaneko is just perfect for you. So with that, I will conclude here and turn the spotlight back to Cindy.
Unable to field audience questions. But you know what, I'm going to just put it out there. If anyone has any burning questions for Professor Laird in the future, please feel free to contact the Japan Foundation Toronto, and we will be happy to pass along your questions.
Absolutely.
I want to get the first thing out of the way, and it's something you touched on in your presentation, and that is the label of women directors. You mentioned that some of these directors, they're trying to distance themselves from this category. And I think often when we say women or female in a description of something, there's this expectation that the discussion will be constrained to something feminine. And would I be overstepping if I were to say that aside from these directors' biological gender, I mean, their artistic visions, their styles, their influences, it doesn't seem like one would otherwise put them in the same category at all? Would that be okay to say?
This is a great question. It comes up frequently, and I think it's something that we grapple with, especially when we're talking about or studying these particular directors. I should say that all of the directors do self-identify as women, right? That's not the issue there. It's this label, woman director. Many of them resist, don't care for it, but there are some exceptions. So Ninagawa, for example, is very upfront about being a woman and being in these media industries. Kawase Naomi, she, she's made a film about herself giving birth, right? So she's very connected to this idea of femaleness, and it carries through in her films. Hamano Sachi, the pink film director, is quite outspoken about her experiences in the pink film industry, and is actually a feminist outright, publicly so. And Haneda Sumiko, the documentarian, has also spoken at length about being a woman, being gendered by the industry. And then she's also quite supportive of women directors and filmmakers and women in the industry as well. So, there are exceptions. We could put them in other categories, right? We could put them by generation. We could put them as like commercial narrative filmmakers. We could call them contemporary filmmakers. When I interviewed Kate Taylor-Jones from Sheffield University, she made this compelling case to also think about the stars or the talents that are in these films. As a point of a connection of influence that shapes the films, right? So if you have some stars that are in multiple directors' works, they lend, certainly their agency often has a hand in what goes on there, right? So we can put them into different categories, but I do think it is important as yet still to think about this question of gender in terms of the industry and experiences and the way that they're perceived, right? Until we have, I think, gender equity, just total equal access to careers and support systems, that it is important to think about similarities in these subject positions, barriers that they face, challenges. And if we don't do that, then we can't enact any change, right? Because we won't be able to. So yes, I agree with you, but also, right, there's
of course
an important utility in doing so.
I'm glad you brought up the matter of how they are perceived, because in the three directors that you chose at the end to talk about, Ninagawa, you said that she has this very feminine style of super saturated pink and red and butterflies, and her subjects are, women and fashion, and she's very much leaning into what is traditionally perceived as feminine. And I recently found out that she directed the new Holic film that came out in April, and I was like, oh, that was very exciting to learn. And then on the other side of the spectrum, Nishikawa Miwa's subjects are very dominated by men, I think, and male-centric stories. So how are they perceived by the critics within Japan?
Quite differently. Yeah, so Ninagawa Mika doesn't always, there's a tremendous love for this first film that I recommended, Sakunan. And then the critics are not so favorable about the films that come after that. Whether I agree with them or not is an issue, a separate issue, a subjective issue. But yeah, her films are thought to be, excessive. They're thought to be frivolous. They're, bad pacing, timing, just navel gazing, too much celebrity, right? So there's I think a derogatory view of her films that in my opinion are quite unapologetic in terms of her vision, what she wants to do. And I frankly really like that about her. So that said, there's still a great love for Ninagawa Mika, who is a celebrity in her own right and a really tremendously hardworking person. Whereas Nishikawa Miwa is reviewed quite favorably, especially by more sort of high art critics, and she's has been nominated and has won awards for the Media Academy of Japan. And she finds herself in circles where she's invited to give lectures. She talks with, roundtable discussions with other very famous filmmakers, right? And in no small part, this is due to that pedigree that she has and the relationship that she has with Koreeda as well. I do think that there is a forefronting of masculinity in her works. She stars these very famous gentlemen, right, who are their own celebrities, award-winning celebrities. And so I think she operates in these different circles, and maybe strategically so, right, by tapping into what people already expect, right, to see. It's interesting to me, Wild Berries, Hebi Ichiko, her first film, is actually, I would say, more a female narrative where there's this young woman who is just really disgruntled with her family. And I really like that film, but it seems to be the only one, and then she takes this curve. The last thing I'll say about Nishikawa Miwa too is that she early in her career, was one of these people who was resistant to talking about gender in the industry. She just like, it really has no place. There's really no difference between a male experience or a female experience in these industries or the kinds of movies that we make. And it's more recently that she's been willing to discuss, well, actually, yes, she's been open about giving up having a family, right? And that she recognizes that a lot of her female colleagues, have to make that kind of a choice. She also has talked about how she became, I think, sort of unwillingly the face of women directors in the early 2000s as well. I mean, she's a very attractive person, and she was often asked to, be sort of representative of this generation, and had nice clothes that were given to her and was, made up. And so I think, she sort of wanted to resist what was happening to her anyways in terms of public reception and presence. But now is willing to talk about it, right? So that was actually a very gendered situation that she was in.
Now that she's very established, do you still see a lot of influence from Koreeda in her work?
I do. I do. This is a total anecdote, but when her film was screened at the Chicago International Film Festival, this most recent one that she had, Under the Open Sky, which has a totally different name in Japanese, right? It's about a shikisekai. Someone asked her if these low camera positions that she was using was some sort of homage to Ozu. which, Ozu was not the only person to use that position, but is probably the most famous, right, for cinephiles. And so somebody asked her if she was paying homage to Ozu, and she sort of laughed it off. She's like, no, no, no. I mean, Japanese houses have low ceilings, so we have to put the camera low, which is quite funny. But on the other hand, her mentor is Koreeda. They work together, right? They support each other. As I said, I think their films speak to one another. And his film, Maboroshi, was an actual homage to Ozu. So like he made this film that was in the Ozu style as an experiment, right? So the influence,
there's a chain of influence,
overt, right? They might not be overtly intentional, but we live in a historical chain, right?
Well, with these three directors that are so artistically distinct from one another, are you able to pinpoint any artistic ancestor that might have influenced them all?
No.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, they have been asked about their influences, and like many, I think, Japanese directors, oddly enough, the influences are often international.
Okay.
Many directors will cite, if the French New Wave as being very important to them, or indie directors in coming out of the United States, not Hollywood, but independent directors, as having an influence on their film tastes or styles. And very few of them will mention Japanese directors. I think Tamaguchi Dusuke is an exception, where he actually says, Mizoguchi, I'm very impressed by his films and they have an impact. But most directors don't. It's really interesting. That said, you can certainly see, I think, influences that might exist under the surface. So Okigami Naoko, I mean, her films remind me of Kitano Takeshi, just visually in a way. Even though clearly, she's developed her own style, working with a Finnish crew, right? So there's something quite distinctly international that's happening with those works. Ninagawa Mika is just a totally unique vision to me. But maybe it's some of that excess that we saw in like Oshima Nagisa's films, for example, especially with those saturated colors. And Nishikawa Miwa, to me, is the clearest that's in this trajectory of of the Japanese classics. And many people, it was particularly her first couple of films, would say, yes, this feels like, a contemporary inheritance of a long trajectory of what we think of as Japanese cinema. Not a work, precise answer, but you can.
No, that was good. Thank you. Just to go back a little bit, one thing you mentioned at the beginning that was very astounding to me was this 40-year gap between Tanaka Kinyo and the popularization of I guess creative women directors in Japan. So that number was very shocking to me. But by coincidence, this month in June of 2022, TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, is actually featuring a Tanaka Kinyo retrospective. I think they're showing all 6 of her films this month. So I was wondering, are you noticing maybe a reminiscence or a growing awareness or newfound appreciation of Japanese women directors, both going back decades and in recent years? And if so, whether that's like a Japanese thing domestically or also on the international stage, and why now? Why in 2022?
Those are all really great questions.
Sorry, that's like 4 questions in one.
Yeah, right. I mean, we are living in a moment where representation matters, right? It's always mattered, but we're now recognizing it, and where there are people who are integrated into organizations like film festivals or retrospectives, right? This Tanaka Kinyo is this retrospective that's kind of making its way around the world at various venues. And the people who are involved in this kind of programming are people who want to see more representation, more diversity, right? To see more inclusiveness and intersectionality. So we're living in this time where that's important to people. And so I think that's a big part of it, is that, people who have been running these festivals, especially like new younger people who are they say, wait a minute, where are the women, right? So they're
Right.
looking for them, and they want to include them. Uh, so I think that's part of the moment that we're living in. When I first started working on women directors, uh, I found that their works mostly were finding a home in smaller film festivals that would specifically like have a theme of women, international women directors. So in part, this was like a feminist move to think about supporting women directors, amplifying, making visible women directors. But they were, when you do that, when you say this is a festival about women directors, there was a tendency for the flyers to be adorned with, flowers, butterflies. I mean, no kidding. Like, this really happened. And then there was this process of gendering. So we did start out with that. And that was about, 15 years ago or so that this was happening. Now there's a bit more of a normalization where Japan Foundation has done this before. This Japan Society has done this before. And then, in Europe, this is happening as well, where women are just being included in the program without necessarily calling attention to them. So there's been this process of normalization. To get back around to Tanaka Kinyo, I think, elevating her status as a director, as a classical director, right, is also a movement away from those flowers and butterflies to a more serious regard of our film history, right, as a director, and not necessarily a floral feminine director.
And you're doing a great part in spreading the knowledge about Japanese female directors. I think our director Shimizu mentioned in her introduction that you are currently in the midst of implementing a project on Japanese women directors at UBC. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And in part, this project is thanks to the funding from the Japan Foundation, which I'm so grateful for. Thank you for funding this project. So it's called the Japanese Women Directors Project. And this will be a multimedia platform. There will be a website that we have that will host predominantly three video series. I want to talk a little bit about why this project came about, not just because I happen to work on women directors, but when I teach in the classroom, I like to shake up this canon that we think of Japanese cinema, right? Mizoguchi, Ozu, Kurosawa.
Yes.
I like to shake this up a little bit, and think about their Tanaka Kinoyo, she existed. Also, there were women screenwriters, right? There were women writers. There've always been women in Japanese cinema. They just haven't been written into the history, right, that we have. So when I teach, I like to shake things up a little bit, and ask other questions, not just women directors, but, like, where are the films from, Ainu folk or people in Okinawa, or their stories, right? Zainichi narratives and visions that they might have, artistic expression, migrants, immigrants, right? Queer folk, and yes, of course, right? So, where are all of these stories? And I like to shake that up. Now, the problem with that is if you don't have materials like articles or books or the films themselves with subtitles, you can't teach them, right? So this project came out of this lack that I think that we have, and I wanted to create a wealth, I think, of educational resources that could be accessed by the public, but could also be integrated into Japanese cinema classrooms. So one of the series is a collection of interviews with film scholars, where I've asked them to either share the work that they're currently doing on women directors or to start working on women directors. So I interview them. That can be used in the classroom as a kind of pseudo lecture. We are also creating director profile videos that can be used in the classroom, as well as some video essays, so analysis and interpretation of these films that can be used in the classroom. We are creating sample syllabi, so ways to rethink, your more standard introduction to Japanese cinema course that integrates works by women. We are, if we get permission, going to share the translation of that Hatsusugata script that we have. We're waiting for some permission to do that, but that would be really exciting. And I've also created a series of formal film analysis videos. So this is a sequence of videos that focuses on, how to analyze mise-en-scène, how to analyze editing, cinematography, and sound. And these are just like basic film 101 kinds of educational tools, except that all the clips come from Japanese cinema. So instead of, teaching students how to do film analysis and then asking them to look at, Citizen Kane in the Japanese cinema classroom, right? Instead, they're going to be looking at Japanese films. And all of the embedded exercises in those videos actually come from works by women. So this is like a process of normalizing the works of women by, not necessarily pointing to it, although I just revealed my hand here. But yeah, is using those works as the exercises, both to encourage people to then go watch those films, right? But also,
and will all this be publicly available?
Yes,
not just educators, but anybody who wants to see them.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the Formal Elements series is on my YouTube site, and we are currently subtitling them in English for accessibility, as well as translating and subtitling them in Japanese as well, so they can be used in classrooms where Japanese language is the dominant language.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I look forward to that. And I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, two of the directors that will be profiled in your project, we are actually, I'm not in charge of that specifically, but I think we're showing 4 of their films this month and next month. I think their names are Ando Momoko and Haneda Sumiko, whom I see that you mentioned in your presentation as well. For those who are in our audience and are unfamiliar with these 2 directors, could you just tell us a little bit more about them to introduce them to our audience before they watch our films?
Yeah, absolutely. So Haneda Sumiko, who I mentioned in my talk, is this incredibly prolific documentary filmmaker who is fortunately still with us today. She was actually born in Manchuria in 1926. It's interesting. But then she joined Iwanami Productions in 1950. She first worked as a film editor before then transitioning into making documentary films. She was, when you work for a studio that is producing documentaries or these educational films or PR films, especially in the 1950s, you didn't really choose your subject matter, that you got assigned to something. And so her first films were very gendered in their assignments, right? Like, go make a film about a women's college, for example, right? So they gave her this task of addressing women's issues or women's lives, and she made these films, and then was able to choose her own subject material. There was recently a retrospective, I think, put on by SOAS over in the UK about Haneda Sumiko, and I do know that there's a upcoming collection of essays and a book about her specifically, which I think will come out probably in late 2023. So that's Haneda Sumiko, documentary filmmaker. And then Momoko Ando has only made 2 feature-length films, but they're both exceptional. So this is a younger director. She's born in 1982, and she studied abroad in the UK at the University of London, and then also NYU, I believe, where she studied filmmaking. So she's coming from this, educational background in film. The 2 films that she's made is Kakeda, A Piece of Our Life, and then 0.5 millimeters. I don't know the Japanese title. I think
those are the films we're screening.
Yeah. All right, great. Yeah, and then she's also but she's also an activist. So she has moved to Kochi Prefecture, and she's very much integrated in this protecting the culture and the lifestyle of this place that has an aging population, right? So you have a place that's had a drain out of young people, dominated by an aging population, and is sort of deteriorating. And she's very much invested in recuperating it, documenting these people's lives, and like helping to rejuvenate the area. So she's really engaged in social activism while also being a filmmaker. She works in television as well. So these 2 films that she's made, they're quite long, but I think you'll see this attention to senior citizens, their lives, their experiences, their histories, what they lived through, that I think young people forget that right, a lot happened in the lives of these senior citizens historically. So in her films, both of them will feature this attention to the lives of older people. As well as gender dynamics, particularly between young women and how they're finding their way these days. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just looking at my notes here. I do believe the Ondo films are being released by JFT the weekend of June 10th. And then the Haneda films are being released the first weekend of July. So yes, please look forward to that. And we're coming up on an hour. I've kept you for a very long time. I just want to finish our chat today with a question that looks ahead. So recently in preparation for this interview, I read an interview with a film critic whose name I cannot remember, who said that the Japanese film market is very domestic-minded because they can often break even with just the domestic return in theaters and DVD sales. What potentials do you see in today's Japanese women directors in terms of breaking and flourishing in the international market, and what challenges might await them?
Yeah, I have been thinking about this as well, particularly since the school year ended, and now I have an opportunity to go back to my research full time, and I've come across this issue of distribution. So, of course, right now I cannot go to Japan. Right, the borders are closed. I do not have a visa to get in, and so I'm finding, for the first time in my career, access to be extremely difficult. So there are quite a lot of women who are up and coming, I think, as far as directors, especially in television and especially for streaming platforms, right? So Amazon Prime really has done a lot to support. I think they have a mission here, right? Because that's not an entirely Japanese company, right? And Netflix too, right? But they're region blocked. So I can't watch them, right? There's no way for me to watch this new cycle of films that are coming out unless I go to Japan. In the past, during the pandemic, I supplemented this by just buying DVDs, which is certainly an expensive route. But if these works are going to be optioned predominantly for streaming only, there won't be DVDs, right? So this has an impact, certainly not only in my own research, but on international distribution, right? It is going to be up to international distributors to really seek them out and make the case for those partnerships, those deals. And they will then assess whether or not that is financially viable for them, right? And so if history has shown us anything with the way that Japanese films have been distributed internationally, you need to have people at those distribution companies who actually care and believe that people will watch films by women, that it will be profitable, right? So it all depends on whether or not the people in those distribution companies believe that to be the case. In the past, not so much, right? so
are these sorry, one more question. I know I said that was the last one, but one more question. So are these women directors working today, are they looking to break into the international market, or are they more focused on telling Japanese stories for the Japanese audience?
I think they want to make films, right? So it depends on how lofty, I suppose, your goals are, right? Kawase Naomi, for example, right, is very, very much an international filmmaker, right? I think she's very focused on Cannes, right, and the award circuit, rightly so. And Okigami Naoko, her training, she left Japan. She puts her films out there. Nishikawa Miwa also submits all of her films to these international film festivals. I'm trying to think of this. There are a couple of directors that we see getting picked up by international film festivals. So I think for them, right, the prestige that comes along with international distribution is desirable. But that's a prestige thing, right? It's not so much about market or sales or profit. It's about prestige cinema and making it. I think for a lot of directors, especially when they're starting out, maybe Hamaguchi Yusuke is an exception. I think he's also after maybe that prestige market. But for a lot of directors, they just want to make a film, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for them, the domestic industry, especially television, is just a great way to start out because that's what they want to do. They just want to tell stories, right? Most people aren't seeking after those prizes. So yeah, I mean, I suppose it just depends on the aspirations of the individual, but I can see why the domestic market is first and foremost in people's minds.
Well, thank you for telling their story for us today.
Of course.
We really appreciate you for your time, for the great presentation you gave, and for the wonderful, insightful questions you gave today. I just want to remind everyone to look forward to the UBC project release, which is what, summer?
This summer, yes.
The summer. And I think once it is available to the public, we will make an announcement as well in our newsletter. And oh yes, and I want to remind everybody to register for our film screenings happening the weekend of June 10th and July 1st, in time for Canada Day. Well, thank you so much once again, and thank you for everyone for watching. I think we can say goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Happy viewing.